Welcome to Most Notorious. I'm Eric Rivenes. My guest, Michael Fedo, has made the tragedy we're going to be talking about today his life's work. He started this project decades ago, conducting first-hand account interviews, doing research and gaining insight little by little until he was able to put together the book we are going to be discussing today, The Lynchings in Duluth, which will be released in a new edition by the Minnesota Historical Society Press on March 15th. That is our topic for today. Thank you so much for your time today, Mr. Michael Fedo. Your book is an important piece of work in that you single-handedly brought this absolutely horrific event into the public consciousness again. When did you first hear about the Duluth lynchings, and how did this book come about?
I first heard it from my mother when I couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. I have lost through the years the context for that. I have no idea why she would have brought it up. I speculate that it may have had something to do with the fact that we lived about a mile or so from where that took place. But I really don't know. I can't remember why she told me that. In any case, it was just kind of there in my head. I knew that this had happened. And as a young adult in my early to mid-20s, I began writing. And sometime about 1970, 71, somewhere back in there, I thought that I was going to write a novel, which I've also forgotten about. I don't remember what my storyline would have been, but I do remember that at one point I thought that I would use this lynching as a scene in the chapter, and the main character in this proposed novel was going to be there would have been there as a witness. And in order to get things correct, even though the account would have been fictional, the actuality of the event needed to be accurate, and I tried to find the book that I assumed someone had written about this episode 50 years before. And I learned rather quickly that there was no such book. Libraries had not only never heard of a book being written about this, but most of the librarians that I contacted in the state didn't even know that this had happened. Finally, there was a librarian at the History Center in St. Paul who said that they had a small folder on this, and I would certainly be welcome to take a look at that, which I did. And then after that, I consulted the newspapers of the era and was able to piece together the story. Well, I spent several Saturdays in the library, and I filled a spiral notebook on notes about this event, and then had an epiphany. This story had never been documented, and since I had a great deal of information, I should be set about to do that, to document this event that occurred in Duluth in 1920. And so I abandoned the novel and immediately set about to try to piece together this story. So that's how it happened. It wasn't my intent to do this to begin with, but it certainly became a strong force as I uncovered incidents and was able to bring this back to public attention because it had been long forgotten. And in fact, it was I suppose, kind of a chauvinistic thing about Minnesota that it was more or less officially forgotten in the textbook history of Minnesota, for instance. In all of the editions up until rather recently, this event was not mentioned in state histories. And that includes another book called The History of Crime in Minnesota. It wasn't in that book either. So this had been, I think, both tacitly and officially expunged from the consciousness of people who lived in Minnesota.
Now, Duluth, for listeners outside of Minnesota, is a city which sits in the northeast part of the state on the shores of Lake Superior. Let's talk about post-World War I Duluth. What was life like there at the time, and what was the racial climate? Certainly, physical manifestations of racism must have been low in this northern part of a northern state.
Well, absolutely. In fact, Duluth at that time was a city of about 100,000 people, and there were, and I think I have this number exactly at long last, there were 483 African descendants living in Duluth out of a population of about 100,000. So it is possible that at that time, a person living in Duluth could have grown to adulthood and possibly never even seen a person of color. So there were very, very few, and as a result, there were virtually unheard of race-related incidents involving citizens of the city. But at the end of World War I, two things happened. It was kind of like a perfect storm. One was that workers at the steel mill in Duluth were working for 25 cents an hour, and they realized that U.S. Steel had made significant profits during the war, and these workers thought that they were entitled to a share of that, and so they threatened to strike for higher wages. In the meantime, the people from U.S. Steel, in order to head off this strike, were recruiting black cotton field workers in the South who were making 10 cents an hour, promising them wages in Duluth that would more than double what they were making picking cotton. Now, they didn't bring up trainloads of black field hands, but they brought up a few, and that was enough to quell the threat. In other words, you guys can strike if you want to, but we can get all of these black folks from the South to come up here and take these jobs who are happy to work for 25 cents an hour. And then you also had veterans returning from World War I. And the U.S. involvement in World War I wasn't very long. They turned the tide of the war, but they weren't in battlefields for a very long period of time. And a lot of these veterans, they got these parades in Paris, and they were heroes, and they liked that. That was heady stuff. And they got back, and things turned ordinary rather quickly back in Duluth. And they were itching for action of some sort, doing something, wanted to be acknowledged. They liked that it happened after the war, taking ordinary jobs as fry cooks or meter inspectors, kind of ruled that out. And they had also seen American black GIs cavorting with white women in France, and they were offended by that. So you had these two elements all coalescing together at the wrong time, when it was kind of heard throughout the community that a young white woman had been raped by 6 black workers from the circus. And all of these feelings just kind of coalesced, and you had this tragedy unfold.
So let's talk about that. A young woman and man, Irene Tuscan and Jimmy Sullivan, decided to go to the circus, the Robinson Traveling Circus, which had set up on the Duluth waterfront on June 14th, 1920. After the circus is over, it's nighttime, and they decided to take a stroll among the tents, where they encountered a group of black men, circus workers, who were relaxing and shooting dice after the show. Can you talk about what might have happened next?
Well, I can only speculate, but my gut instinct would say this, and that stemmed from rethinking about the Emmett Till case back in the 50s, when he was brutally beaten and killed for allegedly having whistled at a white woman in a store. What I think happened in Duluth at that time was that as they walked along, I think something like that happened. Somebody may have made some lewd remark, or maybe a series of lewd remarks, and this young man, Sullivan, could not defend her honor. He was outnumbered, and he felt powerless to do anything about it. And of course, he was the one who reported this to begin with. And I think that he just decided he wanted to make some trouble for those guys. I don't think he anticipated that this was going to be the result, that they would be that they would be killed. But I think that he hoped that there would be some issue and they would get some kind of comeuppance for their behavior toward him and Irene.
So Irene Tuscan and Jimmy Sullivan went home that night. Irene Tuscan went to bed. You speculate that they might have had a discussion about what had happened before parting ways, but we'll never be sure. When were the police notified that she was claiming that she'd been raped?
Well, actually, they were notified that night. Irene went home to bed, and James went to work. And what was at work, he worked a night shift, and his father was the night superintendent at the docks in Duluth. And he told his father that Irene had been attacked. And his father then called the police. And so it was, I believe, sometime after midnight that the police went out to the circus grounds and stopped the train as it was heading toward the Iron Range for performances up there. They stopped the train and made a number of arrests. I think they arrested and brought back to the jail more than a dozen men, 15 or 17 workers, and put them in cells, and everything just kind of moved forward, gathered steam from then on. And the next night, the 15th, is when this horrific event took place, witnessed by, according to newspaper estimates at the time, between 5,000 and 10,000 people who were on the downtown streets in Duluth.
Right. So 120 men were pulled out of the train, lined up for identification, and as you just mentioned, maybe 15 or so were picked out. How did the police know who to take in?
Well, they probably didn't. The ones that they dragged off were the ones who were identified by a foreman as having been in a particular area at the approximate time that this assault was alleged to have taken place. So those were the ones brought to the jail. There was no way that they could know for sure if they had anybody who might have done this or not, but they just took in these people who were allegedly in the area where this was supposed to have taken place.
So rumors of the supposed assault started spreading like wildfire through the city of Duluth the next day. You explain in your book how this happens, how this anger goes from a simmer to a boil through the afternoon. People are hearing all sorts of secondhand stories about what had happened to Irene, and many locals are furious to the point where a mob begins forming outside of the downtown jail on Superior Street, where the men are being held. How did things escalate so quickly?
Well, they were spurred on. There were people who were egging them on, including a fellow who had been driving a truck through the neighborhoods where that girl had lived and exhorting people to come with us and join the necktie party. And drove through neighborhoods and managed to get quite a number of folks to come downtown to participate in this. So that was one. But a lot of the people who were there, now when I say there were between 5,000 and 10,000, there were that many people there, but they were not necessarily all participants. What happened when the attack on the police station and jail began was that there were folks who were downtown who had been working in downtown areas, and because of the great crowds in the street, their streetcars weren't able to get through to take them home, so they were stuck there. There were other people who perhaps had not heard any. You got to remember there was basically no media at all at the time. So other people who wanted to perhaps have gone to a movie or some other event downtown had gone downtown, and once they got there, saw that there was large crowds, and they just kind of hung around and watched, even though some of them perhaps may have wished to have returned home. They weren't able to get out of there. So that made the size of the crowd, extraordinarily large. And it was probably the largest, or one of the largest lynchings where there's a crowd observing that had ever happened in this country.
So it becomes pretty touch and go in the police station. There are a dozen or so police officers holed up inside who are doing their best to keep the mob at bay, and they do so for quite a while.
Yes. Well, to begin with, that's true. There were only a dozen there when all of this began. I think they managed to get most of the police crew on duty as this unfolded, bringing the number of officers perhaps up to 30. But they were under orders to not use firearms, which, if you've got, even if it's 30 cops against 300 or 400 angry people, and you're outnumbered and certainly outmanned. There's almost nothing you can do, especially if you are ordered by the Commissioner of Public Safety to not use firearms.
And why did he order that?
Well, he said later to a reporter, he thought that if they fired into the crowd and killed somebody or injured somebody, that the police would be under a great deal of attack from voters, and because they had done that, and also because he specified he didn't want to see the blood of one white person shed for these Negroes. And so that was probably more the motivating factor than there might be public scrutiny of police action. If they had fired their weapons. Left without that, without being able to do that, there was virtually nothing they could do.
So a real hero in the story is Sergeant Oscar Olson. Can you talk about him?
Well, yes. I spent some time interviewing his daughter back in the early 1970s. And she told me a good deal about his life. He was a big man, and I guess size and heft and strength was probably the only qualification to become a police officer. You had to be a big, tough guy, and Oscar was that. He was a large man, 6'2" or 6'3", and he weighed about 270 or 80 pounds, and he had boxed and wrestled professionally. So in that era, he would have been the typical kind of guy that police forces were looking for, guys with muscle. But he also was a man who tried to do his duty, and he pled with the officers to take stands, and he himself continued to do that, even though he was not able to marshal any forces as this unfolded. Men were injured, they were hit by rocks and just being physically knocked around by the mob. And Oscar Olson stayed with it until the bitter end, doing everything he could to try to turn the tide. And he had moments of temporary success, but in the end, of course, was so badly outnumbered that he also wore down. I think it was about 15 or 20 years later, he was killed in the line of duty trying to arrest someone on a robbery charge, I believe. This criminal had a weapon and shot and killed Oscar Olson.
So the mob finally breaks into the jail and makes their way to the cells where the men have been waiting in terror for hours, hearing the sounds outside. And they yank out, and it's at random, it seems, 3 of the prisoners, Isaac McGee, Elmer Jackson, and Elias Clayton. The men spearheading the lynching attempted to coerce confessions, but the 3 men denied everything. Can you give us an idea of the atmosphere on Superior Street when these men were walked outside of the jail?
Well, they really weren't walked. They were dragged, kicked, and beaten all the way. It was a block away from the station. And this is hard to imagine, but there were people who wanted to get at them, who wanted to be able to say later on that when he was taken into the street, I was able to get in a good punch, or I gave him a good solid kick. or I spit on them. All of those things occurred to these men as they were brought up the hill to be strung up on that lamp pole just below the Shrine Auditorium on First Street in Duluth. So it was complete chaos, screaming at them, swearing at them, and these poor guys were, of course, terrorized, terror-stricken, and knowing that what was going to happen to them. So it was pretty horrific.
So I asked you ahead of time if you wouldn't mind reading a couple of pages from your book, and you were gracious enough to agree. And I want to make sure listeners get a really good understanding of how insane this mob scene was. So this is a passage from Lynchings in Duluth at an especially tense moment when Isaac McGee, one of the three men, is taken from his cell, pulled through the street, and there's a priest as well who tries to intervene. Whenever you're ready, sir.
By now, the quivering, battered Isaac McGee was thrust forward toward the light pole. He stumbled and was kicked savagely. He rolled over, his mouth open, and was snatched up. The rope was lowered over his neck. Women and young matrons cheered and laughed at the crude wit of some of the youthful onlookers who sang and joked, "See what you're coming to. Now hang gracefully. Show us some real style. The less you kick, the less you'll hurt." An intense rush of adrenaline propelled Father Powers, and with his sturdy hands he tossed aside several men as he scrambled toward the pole. Those holding McGee stood back as the red-faced priest stormed forward, not merely to confront those with McGee. Father Powers climbed the pole himself. The mob fell uneasily quiet, preparing to listen to the priest. "We're wasting time," someone hollered out, but was in turn silenced by those around him. "Men, you don't know this man is guilty," Father Powers began, his voice carrying distinctly over the murmuring of the mob. Sweat glistened in his dark, curly hair and had begun to run down his face, forming droplets on his nose and chin. "I know this crime is the most horrible one," he continued, "but let the law take its course." Some in the crowd booed, but they quieted when Powers held up his hand. "It's not too late to stop this tragedy, men. In the name of God and the church I represent, I ask you to stop." There was a momentary silence before several men cried, "To hell with the law. Lynch him," screamed scores of others. "Remember the girl." Several men near the pole reached up and pulled Father Powers down, but he tried to mount it again. "Men, I ask you..." This time the priest was rudely interrupted with cries of, "Lynch him! String him up! The dirty black snakes!" And Father Powers was toppled once more and pushed back within the mob. He made one more futile attempt to reach McGee as the young man was pulled to the pole again. McGee had seemed dazed moments before during Father Powers' attempt to save him, but he was fully conscious now. As the noose was adjusted around his neck, he shrieked, "God be with me! I'm not the right man!" He was hoisted to his feet, and the rope was drawn up, but he fell when the rope loosened. A thin, short man near him tried choking McGee, but was pulled back as the rope was refastened, and McGee was lifted up a few feet off the ground, just clear of the pavement. The crowd had pressed so close that as McGee gasped in his death agony, blood blown from his parted lips spattered on the faces of those near him. "String him up so we can see," demanded the mob. But the rope was too short, and the body could be raised up only a few more inches. And now a new rope was run to the pole, carried over the head of a youth in a green shirt. He was grinning and accepted the cheers of the mob. Then 19-year-old Elmer Jackson was dragged to the pole. One of the men near the pole wore the uniform of the U.S. Navy and stepped forward when one in the mob called, "Let the sailor tie the knot." The sailor grinned awkwardly, then quickly fastened a noose about Jackson's neck. Jackson, however, did not struggle. His face was calm and without emotion as he gazed at the rope taut above his head. He stared out at the mob, and as he was positioned a bit to the right of McGee's dangling body, he drew a pair of dice from his pocket and faced the mob. "I won't need these anymore in this world," he stated evenly, and threw them on the pavement. A young man picked them up and offered them back to Jackson. "Well, you might want to roll them in the next," he said. The noose was cinched about his neck, and a cluster of ready hands drew his body up. As he went into dying convulsions, the crowd began to cheer and whistle. And as he died, his body was lowered a few feet, where it hung before the howling mob.
So thank you for that. So let's talk about what happens next. The mob manages to lynch 3 of the 6 prisoners before they are stopped. Help finally arrives in the guise of the state guard, who dispersed the crowd pretty quickly.
Yes. Yeah, nobody wanted to hang around after that. I think that had the militia not been called out, the other 3 also would have been taken. So the 3 who are still in the cells would have the militia to thank for the fact that they were not also killed. And the militia did what it could to kind of get things cleared out, and apparently the things that I'd read indicated it didn't require a lot of effort at their clearing it out, because when they were called, the crowd just began quickly moving away. So nobody wanted to hang around after the militia was out.
The lynchings, of course, make headlines, and one of the many things I found disturbing about this whole thing is that despite the lack of any evidence, no one ever questioned the girl about whether she was actually lying or not. Instead, the major argument was about mob justice versus justice in the court of law, and whether mob justice could ever be justified.
Well, I think in that era, it was a presumption of guilt, not a presumption of innocence. And there were all of these stories that they'd heard from the South. Lynchings took place in the South principally for the same reason, that there was a black male who had said something or who had allegedly done something to a white woman. And so the way that you protected the virtue of white women was to immediately set upon and kill the black male who had ravaged her. And in many cases, again, it would have been like Duluth, where this kind of assault had probably not happened either. But there was no assumption that the alleged victim of the attack would have lied. The assumption was, of course, this is what happened. And so there were no hard investigations of that. And in the Duluth case, even the statement of the doctor who examined her and who found no evidence of rape, that was never printed in the mainstream press in Duluth. So for years after, most people believed that indeed she had been attacked by these men. Reasonable Duluthians, I'm sure at the time, were thinking, well, maybe this lynching should not have happened. But after all, they did a terrible thing to this girl. I mean, that was kind of the mood in the city. Even though it shouldn't have happened, it wasn't such a bad idea because they got what they deserved anyway.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. When you mentioned the doctor, there were actually a lot of things that pointed to the fact that this rape did not occur. And a detective named Morgan was actually dispatched from St. Paul to Duluth to do an independent investigation. Could you explain the nature of that visit and his conclusions?
Well, yeah, he was sent to Duluth to conduct an independent investigation, and he was able to extract from the doctor the statement that he didn't think that this girl had been raped. I remember when I read that was really impelled me to keep going with this, because now it wasn't just a lynching, but it was a lynching based upon a lie that a girl had been attacked. And beyond that, it set me to thinking that the black folks I interviewed all those years ago who were alive at the time that this episode happened, they all said, now when I'm talking about all, I said maybe 4 or 5 people I was able to talk to who were alive at the time of the lynching, were still alive in the early 1970s. And they all said that there had never been any racial incidents. They never felt singled out. They never felt experienced any kind of prejudice until after the lynching, until after this event. So that their lives changed radically in the aftermath. And so did the lives of a great many citizens of northern Minnesota.
Besides the doctor's visit, could you summarize the other evidence that pointed to Irene Tuskin's fabrication of her rape?
Well, the doctor exam actually is the hard evidence. The rest is somewhat, maybe largely circumstantial, though it's still nevertheless convincing. For example, Irene saying nothing about it to her parents upon her return home, simply taking a bath and going to bed, although she did exchange some words with her mother at that time. Nothing seemed to be amiss. And she seemed to be not the least bit troubled when she returned home following this alleged assault on her. I have subsequently come across some additional information about her that was withheld from me when I was attempting to look for transcripts in Duluth. People have subsequently been able to locate some of that material. And apparently she changed her story a number of times, telling investigators at first that she was with a group of friends at first, and then she was asked who those friends were, and she said, well, she didn't know their names. She'd just seen them around from time to time. And again, it seems unlikely that you don't know the names of your friends. So there were things like this. And her inability to definitely recognize any of those who attacked her cast doubt on the veracity of her accusation.
Now, this whole thing doesn't end after the lynchings themselves. Despite the lack of evidence and 3 men already hanged, the police still feel pressure to find the rapists. So once more, black men from the Robinson Circus are rounded up so Irene Tuskin and Jimmy Sullivan can make their identifications. But Irene really can't identify anyone by their face. She instead picked out a man named Max Mason only because he was the shortest there, at 5'4", and she had told the police earlier that someone short had assaulted her.
Right. She even admitted that. She couldn't tell what they looked like. She identified them by size and physique, she said. He probably didn't really have a chance. They knew there was somebody involved in this who was short. He may have been on that back lot, and they were able to more easily identify him than the others because he was the shortest one there. I think that's how he got nailed.
And another man as well, William Miller, is taken in. So Max Mason and William Miller are both tried for rape independently. The NAACP heads up their defense, hiring attorneys to represent them. Can you talk about the trials of Max Mason and William Miller and the eventual outcomes?
Yes, Max Mason had the NAACP attorneys, and based upon what I was able to read from court transcripts, it seems to me that they didn't aggressively defend Max. I mean, I think they tried, but even though none of this was said, the language and the way I read these transcripts, essentially it seemed to me that they were not disputing the fact that a rape took place, but they were saying that it may have happened, but Max didn't do it, and they were unable to prevail with that kind of approach. Meanwhile, when Miller came to trial, his attorney was a man named Charles Scrutchins, who was from Bemidji, Minnesota. And Scretchens went after the prosecution. And he even made the statement at the end that if this girl was ravished, as she claims to have been ravished, she would be in a morgue. And because he really was very strong and aggressive, Miller was acquitted. Now Mason, who was not acquitted, of course, was convicted and sentenced to 30 years. And back in that day, 30 years meant the 30 years, but he only served 4. And I was unable to locate any record why that early release occurs. The only thing that was in the files of the prison was that he was released on a particular date, and that was it. And furthermore, I was unable to track him anywhere. I made a number of phone calls to people with the name Mason in his hometown of, I think it was Decatur, Alabama, and none of them claimed that they were related to him. And so he just disappeared from any records after his release from Stillwater State Prison.
The piece of evidence that you write in your book was the smoking gun for jurors. In the Max Mason trial, had to do with venereal disease, gonorrhea. Can you explain how that was presented at trial?
Well, yeah, it was revealed that she had gonorrhea and that Max had gonorrhea. And the conclusion was that he gave her this venereal disease. And that was the clinching piece of evidence, because the assumption was that she was a young woman of virtue and Max was a person of low repute, and he had this disease. Well, we do know that he was never treated for the disease. Now, I don't know if that meant that this evidence was somehow fabricated. Probably not, because he admitted that he had a disease, but that he was cured. And in the 3 or 4 months that he was in jail awaiting his trial, he was not seen by a doctor. Meanwhile, her case was pronounced, I think, as an advanced case of gonorrhea. She wouldn't have had an advanced case within just a week or so following this alleged contact with the circus workers. So that seemed kind of bogus, and apparently Max was never treated for the disease while he was in prison either. So it kind of casts aspersion on that whole bit of evidence. But you have to remember that people wanted to get this behind them, and they wanted to believe that something had happened, and that the something that had happened was exactly the way Irene and James had described it, so that the city could leave this with a clear conscience. Yes, the lynching shouldn't have happened, but this is what happened to this girl, and we were finally able to nail this guy with having done it. Now let's put it all behind us.
So let's talk about the men who led the lynchings of Clayton, McGee, and Jackson, the ones primarily responsible for their killings. No one actually served time for murder.
No. 3 of them were convicted for rioting and did a couple of years each. That was it. I think there were a couple brought to trial for murder, but they were acquitted. And after those acquittals, the prosecutor believing correctly, I'm sure, believing that these were the main guys that got the mob going and led the attack. And if we can't convict them, these others that we have in custody, there's no way we can get a conviction for them, so there's no point in going forward with those. So that was essentially the end of it.
So there's a really famous photograph of the lynching. It's in your book. People can also find it on the internet. And a warning to anyone who does, it's pretty grisly stuff. Can you explain the photograph and how it came to be?
Sure. That picture, which if people look at it, it's the equivalent of like a group of guys had gone bear hunting, and they're posing around a trophy shot. And in this case, of course, the picture is not of a bear or a couple of bears, but rather of 3 men that they have just hanged. And people who notice the photograph, they're taken by the fact that this looks very much like a photo that the people, you can see the men around it, have crowded into the shot. And it is as though they certainly wanted to be there. There was no fear of any retribution later on for having participated in this. One of the men in the shot, and these are kind of, you would say, a middle class group of people. You can see people are dressed for an evening out, and at least one of them, as I recall the shot, has a big grin on his face. So this is a trophy shot in a way, horrific as it is. There were no flash cameras back in those days, so in order to light this scene in the first place, somebody drove an automobile and used the headlights for that automobile to light that scene. And a photographer arrived and had to set it up. It isn't like today where you just take out your phone and click, and there it is. He probably had to jockey around with this for several minutes before being able to get it. And then, as was done in the South when lynchings took place, this one also was turned into a postcard, and it sold out very quickly in and around Duluth. So there was a demand for that as a postcard.
Now, some good came out of all of this. The state finally passed anti-lynching laws the next year. What would you say is the lasting legacy of the Duluth lynchings, in your opinion?
Well, in a negative, I think that was the root of a lot of racist opinions and attitudes in northern Minnesota, if not the state of Minnesota. There were so few residents of color in the northern counties of the state. I mean, you could have been born and raised in Duluth or northern Minnesota and grown into early adulthood, and the likelihood was very high that you might never have seen a person of color on the street. So these folks probably didn't have any overt signs of racism in their own lives, but now they were in agreement with a lot of the Southerners who lynched blacks, and these folks, young adults back in 1920, I think passed these attitudes on to their children and grandchildren, many of whom perhaps still hold those racist views. And these racist views were born of a lie that these unfortunate black circus workers had raped a young white girl, and the facts say otherwise. But it was never really revealed in Duluth or northern Minnesota that the young woman was not assaulted. And so people have lived their lives thinking that this is in fact what happened. In fact, there's somebody who's putting things out on Facebook and YouTube videos indicating that this woman was in fact raped. But there's no evidence to support that, and nor does he in his screeds indicate that where any of this information that he might have that she indeed was raped comes from. Also, I think the legacy is also that racism isn't confined to a region. It's universal, and extreme violence and hatred can occur anywhere. But the positive legacy is the memorial site in Duluth, and the people who have worked very hard to get that up, hoping that it will foster a racial reconciliation among people of goodwill. They also have created a curriculum on the incident that any school teacher in the country can download and use for classroom discussions.
Thanks again for your time today.
Well, thank you, Eric. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Again, The Lynchings in Duluth by Michael Fedo is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble online, and in Minnesota bookstores. The second edition, with updated information, releases on March 15th. This has been the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. Visit my Most Notorious page on Facebook or follow me on Twitter at Eric Rivenes. Have a safe tomorrow, and I'll talk to you soon.
This is Peter on his motorcycle.
Oh, the open road!
And this is Peter off his motorcycle.
Please move your paper off my desk. Thank you.
On his motorcycle.
I feel so alive!
Off his motorcycle.
I feel like we covered that already, so...
On.
Wow! Look at the ocean!
Off.
Look at this article I found about urban planning.
You're better on your bike. Progressive helps keep you on it. Get a quote in as little as 3 minutes at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates.